The words fell out of her mouth like stones dropped into still water, rippling outward until they swallowed every sound in the room. "I cannot repay your kindness." Delia Owens stood at the edge of the kitchen, her hands trembling around a cracked coffee mug, her dark hair still carrying the dust of 3 weeks of desperate travel. She looked at the man across from her, the man who had pulled her out of a ditch during the worst rainstorm Sweetwater County had seen in a decade, who had carried her unconscious through his front door, who had given her a warm bed and 3 square meals without asking a single question that she hadn't been ready to answer. And she felt the full, crushing weight of what she owed him pressing down on her chest like a stone. Bennett Ellison leaned back against the doorframe, arms folded, jaw set with that quiet resolve she was only beginning to understand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, weathered by years of honest labor under the Arizona sun. His eyes were the color of creek water in summer, greenish-brown and clear, and they watched her now with a steadiness that made her want to look away and never stop looking at him at the same time. She was leaving. She had made up her mind. She had counted her coins, dried her coat, and written a note she had then crumpled and thrown into the hearth. She was leaving because staying meant something she was not sure she was allowed to want. Staying meant becoming something again, someone's reason, someone's comfort, and the last time she had been that, it had nearly destroyed her. The silence between them stretched until it became its own living thing, and then he said it. "Then promise me breakfast for the rest of my life." His voice was low, unhurried, and entirely sincere. She stared at him. The mug in her hand stopped trembling. "I'm serious, Delia," he said, pushing off the doorframe and stepping toward her with the measured patience of a man who had learned long ago that the things worth having were the things worth waiting for. "I don't want your money. I don't want your gratitude wrapped up in some formal, contractual repayment. I want you to stay. I want you making coffee in my kitchen every morning and burning the biscuits just enough that they're interesting." "I have never burned a biscuit in my life," she said, which was perhaps not the most urgent thing to say in that moment. "Then I want to eat your perfect biscuits for the rest of my life." Her throat tightened. The truth she had been hiding for 3 weeks, the truth about where she had come from, what she had left behind, what was possibly still following her, pressed up against the inside of her ribs like a trapped animal. She had not told him everything. She had not even told him most of it. And if he knew, she was almost certain that the steady warmth in those creek water eyes would go cold. She had arrived in Sweetwater County, Arizona, in the late spring of 1883, though arrive was a generous word for what had actually happened. She had collapsed into a ditch on the South Road during a rainstorm that the local almanac would later describe as the most significant weather event of that year. She had been traveling alone, which was already unusual enough to attract attention in a territory where women rarely moved through the landscape without an escort of some kind. A husband, a father, a wagon train, a reason that other people could see and understand. Her reason was one she had kept entirely to herself. Delia Owens was 26 years old, the daughter of a small-time cattle broker from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and she had been running for the better part of 6 weeks when the storm caught her. She had left behind a life that most people, looking at it from the outside, would have called comfortable. She had a house. She had a position of sorts in the community, not prestigious but stable. She had a man who wanted to marry her, which most people in 1883 considered the end of the story for a woman like her, the resolution of all outstanding questions. The problem was that the man who wanted to marry her was named Gerald Harmon, and Gerald Harmon was the kind of man who smiled at you in public with the warmth of a Sunday preacher. And then, when the doors were closed and the neighbors were gone, made it very clear that you were not a person so much as a possession. She had tried to leave twice before. The first time, she had gotten as far as the edge of town before Gerald's brother, a thick-necked man named Roland, had appeared from behind a livery stable and walked her back with a politeness that was its own kind of threat. The second time, she had packed nothing, told no one, and simply kept walking. She had made it 3 days before Roland found her at a boarding house in a town called Dry Creek, and brought her back with a story about a worried family and a confused young woman who didn't always know what was good for her. The third time, she didn't walk. She rode. She borrowed a horse from a sympathetic neighbor who asked no questions and expected none. And she rode northeast with no plan and no destination, and nothing but the terrible determination of a woman who had finally understood that there was no version of staying that ended well for her. She had been riding for 6 weeks when the storm hit. She had been pushing the horse harder than was wise and eating less than was advisable. And when the lightning opened up the sky above the south road of Sweetwater County, she had been so exhausted and so hungry and so afraid that she had simply slid off the saddle and into the ditch without really deciding to. The horse, with more sense than its rider, had moved to the side of the road and waited. Bennett Ellison had been driving his wagon back from town when he saw the horse standing at the edge of the ditch in the rain. He had almost passed by. He was tired, and it was late, and the storm was the kind that made a man want nothing more than his own hearth and a cup of something hot. But something made him pull the wagon to a stop and climb down, and when he crouched at the edge of the ditch and found a woman half submerged in muddy water, unconscious but breathing, he had done the only thing he could think of. He had pulled her out. He had carried her to his wagon. He had driven home. He had laid her on the bed in his spare room, removed her mud-soaked boots, and covered her with the quilt his mother had made the year before she died. He had built up the fire and sat in the chair by the door and waited for her to wake up, because he did not know who she was or where she had come from or whether anyone was looking for her, and he figured those were questions that deserved to be asked in the right order. She had woken up on a Tuesday morning to the smell of coffee and the sound of rain still tapping at the window pane, though lighter now, more polite. She had lain still for a long moment, taking stock. Her body ached. Her head felt thick and strange. The room was warm and clean and unfamiliar, which was disorienting in a way that took several seconds to process. There was a man in the doorway, not Gerald Harmon. Not Roland, not anyone she recognized. He was holding a coffee mug, the same cracked mug she would later hold herself, weeks later, on the morning she tried to tell him she was leaving, and he was watching her with careful, neutral eyes that were waiting to take their cue from her. "You were in a ditch," he said. "Figured you'd rather be here." She had looked at him for a long, measuring moment, and then she said, "Thank you." That was how it started. In the early days she had been careful. She had kept herself small and quiet and useful in the way that women learn to be when they were somewhere they weren't sure they were welcome. She helped with the cooking without being asked. She swept the floors and mended a torn curtain, and fed the chickens that pecked around the yard with cheerful indifference to everything that had happened in the world beyond the fence. She did not ask about Bennett's past, and he did not ask about hers. They moved around each other with a considerate, almost formal distance, like two people sharing a church pew. His ranch was modest but well-maintained. He ran about 200 head of cattle on land that stretched east toward the low, rust-colored hills, and he had a barn, a bunkhouse, and a main house of 4 rooms that he occupied alone. He had a hired hand named Coop, a wiry, good-humored man in his early 30s who rode out each morning and came back each evening with the weathered satisfaction of someone who genuinely loved his work. Coop had asked no questions either, though Delia sometimes caught him looking at her with a thoughtful expression that suggested he had formed his own theories. It was during the second week that she began to understand who Bennett Ellison really was. It happened slowly, the way most important things do. She would catch him, in the early mornings, standing at the fence and watching the hills go from black to purple to gold as the sun came up. And there was something in his stillness that wasn't emptiness. It was patience, the settled kind that comes from understanding your place in the world and being at peace with it. She would watch him with the cattle and see the way he handled them, firm but never brutal, direct but never harsh. And she thought about how rare it was for a person to have the same face in every room. She started talking to him more. It happened naturally, the way breathing does. She told him she was from Santa Fe. She told him her father had died 2 years earlier from a fever. She told him she had been trying to make her way north to see an aunt in Flagstaff, which was approximately true in the sense that the aunt existed, though whether she had actually been going there was more complicated than she wanted to explain. She did not mention Gerald Harmon. She did not mention Roland. She told herself it was because the story was too long, too complicated, too dark. But the real reason was simpler and more frightening than that. She was afraid that if she told him, he would send her away. Either because he thought the trouble was too much to invite, or because once he understood the full dimensions of who she was and what she had been and what she was running from, he would look at her differently. She had seen that look before. The look that meant, "I had thought you were one thing, and now I see you are another, and I am adjusting my estimate of your worth." Gerald had given her that look more times than she could count. She was not sure she could survive it from Bennett. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that Bennett Ellison had his own dark history, his own carefully kept silence, his own reasons for living alone on a ranch in the middle of Sweetwater County with no wife and no family, and no ambitions larger than the next season. She found out on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week, when she went to fetch a jar of preserves from the cellar, and found, on a shelf she hadn't noticed before, a small framed photograph of a woman and a child. The woman was pretty in a simple, unadorned way. The child was a boy, maybe 3 years old, with his mother's eyes and a serious expression that was almost funny on such a young face. She brought the photograph upstairs and found Bennett in the yard. She did not say anything. She simply held it up. He looked at the photograph for a long moment. Then he sat down on the porch step. "Her name was Clara," he said. "We got married in 1878. She was 23. The boy was Thomas." He paused. "Fever took them both in the winter of 1880. Thomas was 4. The information landed on Delia with a weight she had not been prepared for. She sat down beside him on the porch step, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. "I'm so sorry," she said, which was inadequate but was also the truest thing she could offer. "It was 3 years ago," he said, which was not the same as saying it didn't still hurt. "I kept the ranch going because I didn't know what else to do. Work is a good thing to have when you don't have much else." She thought about the first time she had left Gerald, walking through the dark at the edge of town with nothing in her hands and nothing in her head but the desperate animal instinct to get away. She thought about the boarding house in Dry Creek and Roland's hand on her elbow, polite and iron tight. She thought about what it felt like to be brought back to a life you hadn't chosen. "I understand that," she said. He looked at her sideways, and for just a moment, the careful distance between them contracted, became something more intimate, more uncertain. "I figured there was a reason you were riding alone in a rainstorm," he said. "I haven't asked because I thought you'd tell me when you were ready." "I'm not ready yet," she said honestly, "All right," he said, and that was the thing about him. It was just all right. No pressure, no extraction, no leveraging of the debt she owed him. He simply accepted it and went back to whatever he had been doing, and she sat on the porch for another 20 minutes listening to the late afternoon birds and feeling something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. The feeling frightened her more than almost anything else. The crisis arrived on a Thursday morning, just before the scene with the coffee mug and the almost departure, and the question that changed everything. It arrived in the form of a rider on the South Road, coming up toward the ranch at a canter that suggested purpose, and Delia saw him from the kitchen window and felt all the blood in her body turn to ice. It was not Roland. It was not Gerald. But it was a man she recognized. A man named Pete Dawes, who worked for Gerald's brother as an occasional hired help, and who had the loose, unremarkable look of someone who could go anywhere and be remembered by no one. She had seen him twice in Santa Fe, both times in Gerald's company. She did not wait. She stepped back from the window and pressed herself against the kitchen wall with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Bennett came in from the yard 2 minutes later, wiping his hands on a cloth, and she was still against the wall. He stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he said. No preamble, no warmth to the question, just immediate attention because he could read the situation without being told. "The rider coming up the road," she said. "Do you know him?" Bennett went to the window and looked. "Never seen him before." "You have. He works for someone who has been looking for me." She said it plainly, because there was no other way to say it, and she watched Bennett's face process this information. He did not look alarmed. He did not look accusing. He looked thoughtful, and then he looked at her with the steady, considered attention of a man working out what needed to be done. "Does this person who's been looking for you, do you want to be found by him?" "No," she said. "He is not a safe man." "Then go to the back room and stay there," he said. "I'll deal with this." She wanted to argue, because she was not the kind of woman who went to the back room and let someone else fight her battles. But she was also pragmatic enough to understand that she had no standing here, no leverage, no social cover. She was a woman who had appeared out of nowhere on this man's ranch, and anything she said to Pete Dawes would only confirm that she was here. She went to the back room. She heard the exchange through the thin wood of the wall. Bennett's voice first, relaxed and neighborly, asking the man his business. Then Pete Dawes's voice, which had the slightly oiled quality of someone who was practiced at making lies sound casual. He was looking for a woman, young, dark-haired, traveling alone. Had come off a ranch near Santa Fe about 6 weeks back. Family was worried sick. "Haven't seen any woman traveling alone," Bennett said, and his voice was so even, so straightforward, that Delia pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from making a sound. "Just me and my hired hand out here. You might try the town. The postmaster knows most of what comes through." There was a pause. She could almost feel Pete Dawes looking around, calculating. "Much obliged," he said finally. The sound of hooves fading down the road was the best sound she had heard in weeks. Bennett came to the back room and knocked before he opened the door, which was the kind of detail she would think about later as being very much in character. "He's gone," he said, "but he'll likely ask around. Someone in town may have seen your horse on the day I brought you in." She looked at him. "I'll leave tonight. I don't want to bring trouble to your door, Delia." He said her name with a finality that stopped her. "I'm not going to push you out of this house because someone dangerous is looking for you. That's not how I operate." "You don't even know what you'd be signing up for," she said. "Then tell me." So she told him. She told him about Gerald Harmon, not the version she had been softening in her own head, but the real version, the one with all the hard edges intact. She told him about the way Gerald managed her movements, her friendships, her money, her sense of herself. She told him about the first time Gerald had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave a mark, and how he had apologized so smoothly afterward that she had actually believed him. She told him about the 2 failed escapes and Roland's arm around her shoulders like a polite, suffocating embrace. She told him about the neighbor with the horse and the 6 weeks on the road and the storm. She talked for a long time without looking at him. When she finally stopped, the kitchen was very quiet. Bennett was leaning against the counter with his arms folded and his jaw tight. Not tight with anger at her. She had learned in those weeks to read the different textures of his silences. This was tight with the restrained anger of a man who was choosing not to say certain things because saying them would not help the situation. "He sent someone to track you," he said. "It seems so. Which means he's not willing to let this go." "Gerald doesn't let things go," she said. "He considers it a point of pride." Bennett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "How much time do you think we have before that man finds something useful in town? A day, maybe 2. The postmaster is the chatty sort. Then we'll need to think carefully about what happens next." He pushed off the counter. "But first, you're going to sit down and eat breakfast because you haven't eaten since yesterday and you're going to need your wits." She sat down. He made eggs and bread and strong coffee, and they ate across the table from each other while the morning came fully alive outside the window. And in the particular silence of that breakfast, there was something that felt, despite everything, like the beginning of something rather than the end. After breakfast, they made a plan. It was practical and direct, the way things tended to be when Bennett was involved. He would ride into town himself, ahead of Pete Dawes, and have a word with the postmaster. Not threateningly, just socially. The way a man with deep roots in a community could redirect the natural flow of gossip with nothing more than a neighborly conversation and a well-timed question about something else entirely. He also intended to speak to Sheriff Alderman, who was a reasonable man and an old acquaintance, about the situation in general terms. Delia protested that she didn't want to make trouble for him. He told her, with a patience that was becoming familiar, that trouble had a way of showing up whether you invited it or not, and that he preferred to meet it on his own terms. He was gone for most of the morning. Coop stayed at the ranch, going about his work with the cheerful indifference that Delia had come to find enormously comforting. She helped him mend a section of fence along the east pasture, and they worked in companionable silence for a while before Coop said, without looking up from what he was doing, "He's a good man, you know." "I know," she said. "Not the kind that comes along often." Coop glanced at her sideways. "Just saying." "I know that too," she said, which was the kind of answer that carried more weight than it appeared to. Bennett came back in the early afternoon with news that was partly good and partly complicated. The partly good part was that he had spoken to the postmaster, whose name was Harold, and had successfully steered the conversation into a lengthy discussion about the upcoming cattle auction that Harold found so interesting he had forgotten entirely about the dark-haired woman and the stranger asking questions. The complicated part was that Sheriff Alderman, while sympathetic, had explained the limits of his authority very plainly. Gerald Harmon had done nothing illegal that could be easily proved, and Pete Dawes had done nothing at all except ask a question on a public road. Without a formal complaint and some kind of documentation, there was not much the law could do. He suggested, Bennett said, setting his hat on the hook by the door, that the cleanest resolution would be if you had somewhere to go that was genuinely and obviously not here. Somewhere with people who could account for your presence. "The aunt in Flagstaff," Delia said slowly, Except Flagstaff is north and Pete Dawes likely already knows about the ant. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I was thinking about something different. He looked at her steadily. I was thinking that if you were, legally and publicly, associated with this ranch, if you were, in some official capacity, a person who belonged here, then there's not much a man like Gerald Harmon can claim. You'd be your own woman with your own standing. Delia looked at him for a long time. That is a very careful way of saying something directly. I'm aware of that, Bennett. I know it's too soon, he said. I know we've only known each other 3 weeks, and I know that you came here as someone running from exactly the kind of situation where a man made decisions about your life for you. I am not trying to do that. I'm laying out a possibility. What you do with it is entirely up to you. She stood up and walked to the window and looked out at the yard, the fence, the east pasture where the cattle moved slowly in the afternoon light. She thought about Gerald Harmon, who had never once given her a choice that was genuinely hers to make. She thought about what it meant to be wanted by someone for reasons that had nothing to do with ownership or control. She thought about breakfast. You burned the biscuits this morning, she said, still looking out the window. He was silent for a moment. I didn't actually. I made toast. It was a little burnt. The fire was inconsistent. She turned around. If I stayed, she said carefully, it would not be because of Pete Dawes or Gerald Harmon or the legal convenience of having a clear address. You understand that? I do, he said. It would be because I wanted to stay. That's the only reason I'd want you to, he said. She looked at him, really looked at him, past the surface of the situation, past the immediate problem of danger and logistics and practical considerations. She looked at the man who had pulled her out of a ditch and covered her with a quilt and asked no questions and told her the truth about his own grief and lied to Pete Dawes without hesitation, because she was in his house, and she had asked him not to let her be found. Give me tonight to think about it, she said. Take all the time you need, he said. She thought about it all night, sitting on the edge of the bed in the spare room with the quilt around her shoulders and the moonlight coming in through the thin curtains. She thought about Clara and Thomas, whose photograph she had replaced on the cellar shelf, and she understood that loving Bennett Ellison would mean loving a man who carried grief the way some men carried water, not by pretending it wasn't heavy, but by learning how to hold it without spilling. She thought about her own grief, the subtler kind, the grief of a person who has spent years becoming small enough to fit into a space that was never meant for them. She thought about the coffee mug, cracked along one side, that he had handed her that first morning when she woke up. She had noticed the crack immediately and had thought, with a strange clarity, that he had given her the cracked one because he used it himself every day and had simply reached for the familiar one without thinking. It was not a grand gesture. It was an accident, probably. But it had told her something. She thought about what it would mean to make breakfast in that kitchen every morning, to let herself belong somewhere. By the time the sky outside the window began to lighten, she had made up her mind. She went downstairs early, before Bennett was up. She found the cast iron skillet and the flour and the eggs and the small ceramic crock of bacon fat. She made biscuits. She made them from a recipe her mother had taught her when she was 7 years old, pressing the dough with careful, practiced hands, cutting them into neat rounds, sliding them into the oven. She sliced bacon and laid it in the skillet and cracked eggs into a bowl and whisked them with a fork until they were pale and foamy. By the time she heard his footsteps on the stairs, the coffee was ready and the biscuits were golden, and the kitchen smelled like the best possible version of morning. He came through the door and stopped. She was standing at the stove with a dishcloth over her shoulder, and she looked at him across the kitchen, and she said, "I'm staying." Something moved in his face that she had not seen before. Not surprise, exactly, but something deeper, something that suggested he had hoped for this without letting himself believe it. "Good," he said, which was perhaps the most understated response to the most important thing she had ever said, and she found she loved him a little for it right then. "Sit down," she said. "Breakfast is ready." He sat down. She brought the plates and the coffee and the biscuits, and they ate together at the kitchen table while the morning came up golden outside the window. And for the first time in longer than she could easily count, she felt something that was not just safety but happiness. The specific, grounded happiness of a person who has finally stopped running and found, against all odds, somewhere worth stopping. The matter of Pete Dawes was resolved 3 days later, somewhat anticlimactically, when the man rode back out of Sweetwater County in the direction he'd come from, apparently satisfied that his lead had gone cold. What had happened to change his mind was never entirely clear, but Delia noticed that Coop had been away for an evening and came back the next day with a fresh bruise over his left eyebrow and a deeply satisfied expression that he declined to explain. She did not ask. She signed the documents on a Tuesday morning in the lawyer's office, with Bennett sitting beside her as a witness. And when it was done, she felt something she had not expected. Not relief, exactly, but the particular sensation of a door closing firmly behind you. On the ride back to the ranch, she said, "I want to tell you something." "All right," he said. "When I first woke up in your spare room the morning after you pulled me out of the ditch, I was terrified, not of you, but of hoping. I had gotten so used to not hoping that feeling it again was almost physically painful." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. "What were you hoping for?" "I don't know exactly," she said. "That was the frightening part. I couldn't even name it. It was just this, reaching somehow. This reaching towards something that I thought I'd lost the ability to want." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know what that's like." She believed him. She thought of Clara and Thomas and the winter of 1880. "I know you do," she said. He reached over without taking his eyes off the road and put his hand over hers where it rested on the seat between them. He didn't squeeze it or make a production of it. He just left his hand there, warm and solid, and she turned her hand over and held his. They rode the rest of the way home like that. The weeks that followed were the most complicated and the most beautiful of Delia's life up to that point. And they were complicated precisely because they were beautiful. Because good things always require more care than simple things. Require a kind of sustained attention and honesty that is genuinely difficult to maintain when you are also learning to trust someone after spending years learning not to. She had moments of doubt. Everyone does, she supposed, but hers were particular and specific. There were evenings when Bennett came in from the range tired and short with frustration over some problem with the cattle or the fence or the water supply. And for a moment, just a moment, something cold would move through her, some old defensive instinct reaching for her like a reflex. Then he would wash his hands and sit down and tell her plainly what was wrong, the way a person talks to another person rather than a threat or a convenience, and the cold thing would recede, and she would be back in the present, in the kitchen, in her own life. There were also moments of such uncomplicated happiness that she wasn't quite sure what to do with them. The morning he showed her the particular spot in the east pasture where you could watch the sunrise come up between two specific hills and get the most extraordinary light, and they had stood there together in the cold early air for nearly an hour, saying almost nothing, watching the world come alive. The afternoon he had ridden back from town with a book tucked into his saddlebag, a novel she had mentioned in passing, offhandedly, 3 days earlier, because he had seen it at the general store and thought of her. He had handed it over without comment, as though it were nothing, and she had held it in both hands and felt her throat tighten with something that took her a moment to identify: being known. That was what it was, being known without being held in place by it. She told him about her mother, who had died when Delia was 14 from a lung illness that had taken most of a winter to complete. She told him about growing up on the edge of her father's business, not in it, never directly included, but close enough to absorb a great deal about how money worked and how men operated, and what the gap was between what people said and what they meant. She told him about a friend she had lost, a woman named Marion, who had married young and moved west with her husband, and then simply stopped writing, and about how Delia had always wondered whether that silence was chosen or imposed. He listened to all of it. He asked careful questions when he asked anything at all. He did not offer easy comfort or tell her that everything happened for a reason. He simply absorbed what she gave him with the same patient attention he gave everything, and she found, to her own surprise, that this was what she had always wanted from someone: not to be soothed, but to be heard. He told her about his father, who had come to Arizona from Tennessee with nothing but a horse, a rifle, and a particular idea of himself that the territory had spent 30 years testing and refining. He told her about learning to work cattle as a boy, and how the work had taught him more about patience and consequence than anything else ever had. He told her about meeting Clara at a church social in 1877 and knowing almost immediately, not in a theatrical way, not in a way that made good conversation, but in the quiet internal way of a man who recognizes something true. "Is it strange?" Delia asked one evening, talking about her to me. He thought about it genuinely, which was characteristic. "No," he said. "It would be stranger not to. She was real. Thomas was real. Pretending otherwise would be a kind of dishonesty, and I don't have much patience for dishonesty. Even when the honest thing is hard, especially then," he said. She looked at him across the table. "Then I'll tell you something honest. Go ahead. I am more frightened of how much I care about you than I have been of almost anything in my life, and I have been genuinely frightened of several things." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I feel the same way." "That's not comforting," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's honest." She laughed, actually laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. And he smiled at her across the table, the kind of smile that was entirely private, meant for no one but her. And she thought that she could probably look at that smile for the rest of her life without getting tired of it. The courtship, if that was what to call it, was conducted in the quiet, unglamorous rhythms of ranch life, which meant it looked nothing like the romances described in the novels she had read as a girl. There were no grand declarations made in parlors. There were no flowers delivered by nervous suitors. There were long days of work and shared meals and evenings on the porch watching the sky go through its evening theater, gold to orange to purple to the deep, star-scattered black of an Arizona night, and there were conversations. Long ones, short ones, the kind that resolve nothing and the kind that resolve everything. There were mornings when she made breakfast and he brought in firewood, and they coordinated the early hours of the day with an effortless efficiency that she had to remind herself was not something everyone had. There were evenings when they disagreed, about the best approach to the problem of the broken irrigation ditch, about whether the new bull coop had located in Tucson was worth the price, about a dozen ordinary questions. And she discovered that disagreeing with him was also safe, that he argued the way he did everything else, directly and without cruelty, and that he listened even when he thought she was wrong. The first time he kissed her, it happened in the barn on a September evening when they had been working late on something with one of the horses, and the barn smelled of hay and the warm animal presence of the horses, and the light was failing beautifully outside the open door. She had said something. She could never quite remember what later, and he had looked at her for a long moment and then stepped toward her and kissed her with the same unhurried certainty with which he did everything, and her hands had come up to the front of his shirt without her quite deciding to put them there. They stayed like that for a long time. When they finally separated, she pressed her forehead against his shoulder and felt his hand come up to the back of her head, and she thought, "This is it. This is the thing I was reaching toward." That feeling in the spare room the first morning, that unnamed reaching, this was what it was pointing toward. "I should probably ask you properly," he said, his voice low and a little rough. "Rather than just telling you I want you to make me breakfast for the rest of my life." "That was a proposal," she said into his shirt. "A very strange one, but it was a proposal. It was more of an opening statement." She lifted her head and looked at him. "Then make your case." He looked at her steadily, seriously, without the deflection of humor. "Delia," he said, "I have not felt anything close to what I feel for you since before I lost my family. And for a long time I didn't think I would again, and I had made my peace with that. And then you ended up in a ditch on my road, which was terrible for you but was perhaps the best thing that has happened to me in years. I know your life has been hard. I know you've been hurt in ways that make trusting anyone a complicated and courageous act. I know this is fast, by any ordinary measure, but I would very much like, if you're willing, to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret staying." She considered him. She considered the barn and the horses and the fading light and the specific, anchored feeling of standing in a place that had slowly, without her fully realizing it, become home. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." They were married in November of 1883 at the county courthouse in Sweetwater, with Sheriff Alderman and his wife as witnesses, and Coop standing off to the side with his hat in his hands, looking pleased with himself in the way of someone who has seen the right outcome arrive exactly as expected. The ceremony was brief and direct, because both of them preferred it that way. The ride back to the ranch afterward was longer than the ceremony, and they spent most of it talking about nothing in particular, and it was perfect. That evening, Delia made the best dinner she had ever cooked in her life. A roast with root vegetables and bread and preserved plum jam from the cellar. And they ate it together at the kitchen table with the lamp lit, and the fire going and the night settled comfortably around the house. And she felt the remarkable sensation of a person who has arrived at the right place at exactly the right time. Later, sitting on the porch after dinner in the clean November cold, Bennett said, "I'll ride to the land office in the new year and have your name added to the deed." She looked at him. "That's a significant thing to do. It's your ranch as much as mine," he said simply. "You've worked it like it is." She thought about what that meant, what it meant to have her name on something, to be a legal owner of the ground she stood on, to be a person with standing in the most literal possible sense. In 1883, in Arizona Territory, this was not a small thing. It was in fact a remarkable thing, the kind of thing that most women in her position could not count on and many would not think to ask for. "I wasn't going to ask," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I offered." She reached over and took his hand in the dark. The winter that followed was the quietest and most contented season of Delia's life to that point. The ranch demanded constant work, even in the colder months. There was always something to mend or maintain, always the cattle to manage, always the calculations of feed and cost, and whether that ran beneath ranch life like an underground river. She learned more about cattle in that winter than she had ever expected to know, partly because it was useful and partly because she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she was genuinely interested. She had ideas. She told him about them carefully at first, uncertain whether he would receive them as contributions or interference, and then less carefully, as she understood that he took her thinking seriously. They talked about the irrigation problem for most of December, and came to a solution together in January that was better than either of their individual approaches had been. She noted that the eastern section of the range was producing better grass than the northern section, and suggested rotating the cattle through in a pattern that would let the northern section recover. And he tried it in the spring and found she had been right. He never made her feel small for being right. She noticed this the way you notice something whose absence you've been braced for. In February, a letter arrived from Santa Fe. It was not from Gerald Harmon. It was from the neighbor who had lent her the horse, a woman named Estelle Walsh, who had somehow found her address through a chain of correspondence that Estelle described cheerfully as more complicated than she had expected. The letter said, among other things, that Gerald Harmon had married a woman from Albuquerque in December, which had come as a surprise to everyone, and that Roland had moved to Texas, and that Estelle hoped Delia was well and had found somewhere good. Delia read the letter twice and then put it down on the kitchen table and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't realized was still tight. "Gerald got married," she told Bennett. He looked up from what he was reading. "Good. In December." "So about 6 weeks after we got married," he said, "which means he moved on with notable speed." "I was never really the point," she said, which was something she had understood intellectually for a while, but was only now feeling in the deeper, more settled way of a truth that has fully arrived. "He wanted a certain kind of order. I was just what he had." "He was a fool," Bennett said, which was neither eloquent nor particularly complex, but was delivered with such calm certainty that it landed like something much larger. She smiled. "I'm going to write back to Estelle." "Tell her she's welcome here any time," he said, and went back to his reading. She wrote to Estelle. The correspondence that followed became one of the consistent pleasures of her life over the coming years. A long conversation conducted in letters between two women who had each, in their different ways, navigated a world that kept trying to tell them what they were allowed to want. Spring came and the ranch woke up with it. The particular explosive energy of the Arizona landscape coming back to life after winter. The calving season kept everyone busy for 6 relentless weeks, and Delia threw herself into it alongside Bennett and Coop, learning things she had not expected to learn, doing things she had not expected to do, and finding in the exhaustion and the difficulty something that felt like the right kind of tired, the kind that comes from doing work that matters. It was during the calving season that she first truly understood the relationship between Bennett and his land. She had known it intellectually before. She had seen it in the mornings at the fence, in the careful way he managed his livestock, in the way he talked about the hills to the east as though they were old acquaintances. But watching him during those 6 weeks, seeing the absolute commitment he brought to every difficult birth, every struggling calf, every crisis that required both physical strength and clinical judgment, she saw something that moved her. He did not do this work for status or money, though the money mattered. He did it because he was someone who took seriously the responsibilities of care. Whatever he was responsible for, the cattle, the land, the men who worked with him, the woman he had married, he met those responsibilities without drama, without complaint, without the need for recognition. He simply did what needed doing every day, and he did it well. She thought that this was perhaps the rarest quality a person could have. Late one April evening, with the worst of the calving season behind them and the ranch settling into the more manageable rhythms of late spring, she told him this. They were sitting at the kitchen table with coffee and the remains of dinner, and she said it plainly, because she had learned from him that plain was usually best. "I think you might be the most fundamentally decent person I have ever met," she said. "And I have been thinking about how to say that for approximately 4 months." He looked at her. Something moved in his face that she was by now fluent in reading. "That's a generous assessment. It's an accurate one. I'm not always patient," he said. "I can be stubborn. I've made serious mistakes." "I know all of that," she said. "It doesn't contradict anything I said." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the same gesture from the ride back from the lawyer's office, the same warmth. "I love you," he said. "In case that hasn't been clear enough, stated plainly, I love you." She turned her hand over and held his. "It's been clear," she said. "I love you too," also stated plainly. He smiled, the private one, the one that was just for her, and squeezed her hand, and that was that, and it was everything. The summer of 1884 brought its own dramas, the kind that belonged entirely to the territory rather than to their private history. There was a dispute over water rights between several ranches in the county that occupied most of July, and required a significant amount of careful negotiation and the occasional intervention of sheriff aldermen. Bennett was involved in the negotiations in the capacity of someone everyone seemed to agree was fair-minded, which meant he spent several evenings at meetings in town, while Delia managed the ranch in his absence with a competence that surprised Coop, though she noticed it didn't seem to surprise Bennett. She didn't push. She had not forgotten what it felt like to have your silence respected, but she was kind in the ways she could be, and she thought she noticed as the summer wore on that Coop seemed lighter, less careful, more himself. In September, Delia discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for about 2 weeks before she was sure, and she was sure before she told Bennett, because she needed to be certain before she put the words into the air where they could become real and permanent. When she was certain, she told him on a quiet Sunday morning before breakfast, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the window, because it seemed right to tell him in the room where everything important seemed to happen between them. He went very still. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her, and she felt him take a long, careful breath against the top of her head. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I'm well," she said. "I'm very well." She could feel something in him, a complex, layered thing, the joy and the hope mixed together with something she recognized as the grief of a man who had lost a child before and knew, therefore, what it meant to love one. She held him tighter. "It'll be all right," she said. "I know," he said, and she understood that he was saying it the way you say things you're working hard to believe, and she loved him for that too. The pregnancy changed the shape of the days in ways that were mostly practical. She continued working, because there was always work, and she would not be managed or coddled, but she was more deliberate about her limits, which she was honest with herself about being a difficult thing to accept. Bennett did not tell her what she could and couldn't do. He made sure she had what she needed and let her make her own decisions, and only occasionally, when he thought she was being particularly unreasonable about how long she stood in cold water dealing with irrigation problems, said something quiet and direct that she usually chose to listen to. She saw a doctor in town, a man named Dr. Price, who was competent and businesslike and who told her with the particular bluntness of frontier medicine that she was healthy and the pregnancy was proceeding normally and that she should eat well, rest when she could, and come back in 3 months. She followed 2 of those 3 instructions with enthusiasm, and the third with selective compliance. The letters from Estelle continued throughout the pregnancy, and Estelle proved to be the kind of correspondent who had thoughts about everything and was not shy about sharing them, which Delia found enormously entertaining. Estelle's letters were full of news from Santa Fe, commentary on various people. They both knew philosophical observations about the nature of women's lives in the West that were considerably more pointed than anything Estelle had said out loud in person. And occasional, touching expressions of genuine affection that reminded Delia that friendship, real friendship, was something that required no proximity to remain alive. She also wrote to her aunt in Flagstaff, the real aunt, the one who had always been somewhat ahead of her time and had married and then outlived 2 husbands and managed her own affairs with notable competence. Her aunt's name was Vera, and she wrote back with the warm, practical energy of a woman who had found life interesting for 71 years and intended to continue doing so. Vera came to visit in December, traveling by stage with a trunk and a complete absence of anxiety about it. And she and Bennett took to each other almost immediately in the way of 2 people who shared certain fundamental values about directness and the proper use of one's time. Vera stayed for 3 weeks and was, by unanimous agreement, excellent company. She also said, on her last evening before the stage back to Flagstaff, sitting at the kitchen table with Delia while Bennett was in the barn, "He is a very good man." "I know," Delia said. "Not obviously so," Vera said. "Not in the way that announces itself, quietly good, the sustainable kind." "Yes," Delia said. "Exactly that." Vera looked at her with the measuring eye of a woman who had known her all her life. "You are happy," she said, with the particular inflection of someone confirming something rather than asking. "Yes," Delia said. "Genuinely." Vera nodded once decisively, as though this settled an argument she had been having with herself. "Good," she said, and picked up her tea. Their son was born in February of 1885, a month that in Arizona could produce days of such crystalline, cold blue beauty that the world looked remade. The labor was long, longer than Dr. Price would have preferred, though he kept this professional concern to himself at the time and only mentioned it afterward when things had resolved. And it was harder than Delia had imagined it would be, which she later attributed to the fact that she had imagined it with too much intellectual distance and not enough visceral acknowledgement. But it ended, as these things mercifully do, and the result was a boy of considerable lung capacity and a certain determined expression that Bennett said he recognized. "He looks like you," Delia said, exhausted, holding the baby with both hands like something extraordinarily precious, which he was. "He has your stubbornness," Bennett said. "He's 4 minutes old, I can already tell." She looked up at him. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his face doing the complicated, overwhelmed thing that she had only seen it do once before, and she understood completely. "Thomas would have been 8, she said quietly. "He would have," Bennett said. They sat with that for a moment, the presence of the lost and the presence of the new existing together in the same room, which was exactly as it should be. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Joseph," he said. "After my grandfather, if you're willing." "Joseph Ellison," she said, trying it. "Yes, I think so." Joseph Bennett Ellison was recorded at the county courthouse 12 days after his birth, and Sheriff Alderman, who seemed to have taken a grandfatherly interest in their domestic progress, congratulated Bennett on the courthouse steps with the particular satisfaction of a man who likes to see things work out. The first months with Joseph were their own kind of education. Delia had not had significant experience with infants, and the learning curve was steep in the specific, sleep-deprived way of new parenthood. Bennett was not of the generation or the background that considered infant care exclusively the province of women, and he made this clear from the beginning by simply being present and involved in a way that Delia suspected was not entirely common. Coop, who was a devoted if occasionally awkward honorary uncle, went to town one Saturday and came back with a small carved wooden horse that he presented with such studied casualness that it was obviously something he had thought about for weeks. Joseph was 3 months old and mostly interested in things he could put in his mouth, but he accepted the horse with the open-handed grasp of early infancy, and Coop looked quietly delighted. As Joseph grew, he became what both his parents had probably expected from the genetic evidence: a child of considerable determination, robust curiosity, and a laugh that seemed too large for his body. He was interested in everything on the ranch, with the unreserved, explosive interest of a small child for whom the world is entirely new. The horses were a particular obsession, and Bennett began sitting him on a horse in front of him at around age 2, walking slowly around the yard, and Joseph's expression during these rides was one of absolute sovereignty. The ranch expanded in the spring of 1887, when Bennett and Delia, discussing it together over the course of several weeks in the thoroughgoing way they discussed all significant decisions, concluded that they had both the capacity and the need to increase the herd. This required a trip to a cattle auction in Tucson, which was the first time Delia had been to a significant town since coming to Sweetwater County, and the experience was interesting in several ways. She wore a good dress and sat beside Bennett at the auction with Joseph on her lap, and she watched the way people looked at her specifically, and noted that the look was different from what she had expected. She had expected something measuring or skeptical, the particular sideways assessment that women who didn't fit neatly into expected roles sometimes attracted. Instead, she got something more straightforward. She was Mrs. Ellison of Ellison Ranch, which by 1887 was a reasonably well-regarded operation in Sweetwater County. She was here with her husband and her son, and she was clearly paying attention to the auction, and people talked to her accordingly. She bought 2 cows that Bennett had been uncertain about, and when they turned out to be excellent additions to the herd, she told him so with a satisfaction that was entirely unsubtle. "You're insufferable when you're right," he said. "I have very good cattle instincts," she said. "You have good instincts about everything," he said. "It's one of your more challenging qualities." She put her arm through his on the walk back to the wagon, and he looked down at her with the private smile, and she thought that she had somehow ended up exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not something she had ever expected to feel. The letter from Estelle in the summer of 1887 contained news that Delia had not anticipated. Estelle was getting married to a widower from Taos with 3 grown children and what Estelle described as a deeply sensible approach to life. She was asking, with what she characterized as considerable nerve, whether Delia and Bennett might come to Taos for the wedding in October. They went. All 3 of them, which meant organizing travel with a 2-year-old Joseph, who treated the stagecoach as a personal adventure and the passengers as an audience. The wedding was simple and cheerful, in a small church with the October light coming through the windows at a slant that made everything look like something preserved in amber. Estelle, getting married at 38 with the confidence of a woman who has chosen things deliberately rather than accepted them by default, was radiant in a way that had nothing to do with the dress and everything to do with the specific brightness of a person standing exactly where they want to be. Delia held her hand before the ceremony and said, "You look wonderful." "I feel wonderful," Estelle said, "which is more important and also something I didn't know when I was 20. "I didn't know it at 20 either," Delia said. "What changed your mind?" Delia thought about a cracked coffee mug, and a quilt and a man who lied to Pete Dawes without hesitation, and added her name to the deed of land he had built with his own hands. I found someone who was better at knowing what he wanted than I was at denying what I wanted, she said. Estelle laughed. That's a diplomatic summary. He pulled me out of a ditch, Delia said. I was going to leave and he asked me to make him breakfast. And you stayed. I stayed. Because of the breakfast request, because he meant it absolutely, she said. Because it wasn't a transaction. It was an invitation. The return from Taos was enlivened by Joseph, who had decided during the trip that the word no was a philosophical position to be debated rather than a practical instruction to be followed, which kept both his parents occupied and eventually produced a truce that involved a small carved wooden toy purchased at a shop in Albuquerque and the promise of a proper bedtime story. They arrived back at the ranch on a Tuesday evening to find Coop had kept everything running with his characteristic quiet competence, and the sight of the ranch in the late October light, the main house with its 4 rooms and the barn and the east pasture rolling toward the rust-red hills, hit Delia with a warmth so deep and so physical that she put her hand over her chest for a moment. "Home," said Joseph from the seat between them, which was his new favorite word. "Yes," said Delia. "Home." Bennett glanced at her. She took his hand. The years between 1887 and 1890 were the kind of years that don't make good stories because they are too full of good things to be dramatic. The ranch grew steadily, reaching a size where they needed 2 additional hired hands alongside Coop, both of whom turned out to be steady and capable men who quickly became part of the rhythm of the place. Joseph grew with the ranch, passing through the stage of wanting to do everything with a stubbornness that both his parents recognized from close experience, and entering a phase at around age 4 where he had opinions about the correct management of the cattle that he expressed with an authority that Coop found genuinely funny. Delia's second pregnancy announced itself in early 1889 with the same quiet certainty as the first, and she told Bennett in the kitchen again, on a morning so similar to the first time that they both noticed it. "Same room," he said. "The kitchen seems to be where things happen," she said. "You could have picked somewhere more dramatic," he said. "This is dramatic enough," she said. "Also dramatic. We're going to need a larger house." This turned out to be correct. Their daughter was born in October of 1889, on a day when the sky was the deep, saturated blue that Arizona reserves for autumn, and she arrived with considerably less drama than Joseph had, and a certain bright-eyed alertness that suggested she had arrived with specific plans. "She's going to be trouble," Coop said when he came in to see her on the first afternoon, hat in hand, an expression one of pure enchanted admiration. "She's 4 hours old," Delia said. "Look at those eyes," Coop said. "She's already thinking something." They named her Margaret, for no one in particular, just because it suited her, and because it was solid and clear and could be shortened to Maggie if she turned out to want that. The larger house was built over the winter of 1889 and into the spring of 1890, with the help of several neighboring families and a carpenter from town, and the expansion added 2 rooms to the east side and a broader porch that ran the full length of the south face of the house. It was not a grand house by the standards of any major city, but it was well built and warm and exactly right for the life that was being lived inside it. Joseph, 5 years old and very much himself, gave the new rooms a detailed inspection and announced that the larger porch was his preferred development. He could see the East Hills from it more clearly, he explained, and when he stood on the second porch rail he could see quite far. "Please do not stand on the porch rail," Bennett said. "I can see all the way to the hills," Joseph said. "You can see the hills from the ground," Bennett said. "It's not the same," Joseph said, with the reasonable certainty of a 5-year-old who has reached a considered position. Delia, who privately agreed that it was not the same, said nothing, which Bennett correctly interpreted as mild collusion and chose not to address directly. By 1890, Ellison Ranch was one of the more established operations in Sweetwater County, known not just for the quality of its cattle but for the particular way it was run: fair wages, reasonable hours, the kind of management that kept good people rather than cycling through them. It was the kind of reputation that built slowly and held firmly, and it was the work of both of them equally, though the territory's legal and social structures were not always consistent in acknowledging this. Delia was aware of the injustices that shaped the world she lived in, aware of them in ways that were sometimes abstract and sometimes very immediate. She was aware that the legal protections and standing she had were exceptional rather than standard, the result of specific choices by a specific man rather than the guarantee of any system. She was aware that other women lived in versions of the situation she had escaped, without the luck of the ditch or the stranger with the wagon. She talked about this with Vera, who was now 74 and still writing letters of considerable sharpness, and with Estelle, whose married life had given her both happiness and a new set of observations about the persistent gaps between what was promised and what was delivered. She could not fix the world, but she did what she could within her reach. She was known in Sweetwater County as someone you could come to with a problem, and she took that seriously. There was a woman who appeared at the ranch gate in the summer of 1891, in circumstances that were, to Delia, entirely recognizable. Her name was Louise, and she was 24 years old, and she had been traveling alone, and she was afraid. Delia brought her in and fed her and did not ask any questions until Louise was ready to answer them, which took 2 days. Bennett dealt with the situation with the same unhurried practicality he had brought to hers 8 years earlier, and within a week, Louise had a plan, a legal document, and a letter of introduction to a woman in Phoenix who ran a boarding house and was known for discretion. Louise left on a Wednesday morning with more resources than she had arrived with, and she wrote, several months later, to say that she was well. Delia read the letter at the kitchen table and felt something deep and clear move through her. Bennett came in and she handed him the letter without comment. He read it. Then he set it down and looked at her. "You're the reason she made it," he said. "We're the reason," she said. He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement but in something more like wonder. "You never stop seeing what needs to be done," he said, "and then you just do it." "I was the person who needed the ditch once," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment. Then he stood and came to where she was sitting and kissed the top of her head, the familiar, particular gesture she associated with moments when he was feeling something too large for words. She put her hand up and caught his. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, in November of 1893, Delia woke before Bennett for the first time in as long as she could remember. She went downstairs in the dark and built up the fire and started the coffee, and while the coffee was heating she made biscuits, the same recipe, always the same recipe, golden and perfect and not burnt in the slightest. She made eggs and sliced bacon and set the table with the good plates, the ones they kept for occasions that mattered. When she heard his footsteps on the stairs, she was standing at the stove with the dishcloth over her shoulder, and the kitchen smelled exactly as it had on the morning she had told him she was staying, and she thought about how much had happened in the space between that morning and this one, and how none of it, not a single piece of it, not the hard parts or the frightening parts or the parts that had taken more courage than she'd known she had, none of it was anything she would trade. He came through the door and stopped the way he had that first morning. "You're up early," he said. "10 years," she said. "I thought we should start it right." He looked at her across the kitchen with creek water eyes that had not changed in a decade except to become more familiar, which was the best possible kind of change. "Sit down," she said. "Breakfast is ready." He sat down. Joseph appeared at the top of the stairs approximately 3 minutes later, 9 years old now, with his father's steady eyes and his mother's unstoppable determination, and announced that he had smelled bacon from his room. Maggie, 4 years old and entirely herself, appeared shortly after and climbed into her chair with the certainty of someone who belongs exactly where she is. They ate breakfast together, all four of them, in the kitchen of the house they had built, on the land they had worked, on the ranch that had started as one man's careful effort to keep living after loss, and had become something larger and warmer and more alive than he had ever imagined it could be. Bennett poured coffee and looked at his daughter, who was explaining something complicated and apparently urgent to her biscuit, and at his son, who was eating with the focused efficiency of a 9-year-old who had plans for the morning, and at his wife, who was watching both of her children with the particular expression that she wore when she was being happy without fully realizing she was showing it. "Good biscuits," he said. She looked up from the children and met his eyes across the table. "They're always good, never burnt. I told you I never burned a biscuit in my life." "You did tell me that," he said, "on the most important morning of my life, for the record." She looked at him steadily, and the private smile came, the one that was his, that had always been his, that had never stopped feeling like a gift. "You pulled a woman out of a ditch," she said. "Best decision I ever made," he said. "You asked her to make you breakfast. She said she couldn't repay my kindness. I told her what repayment I wanted. And she stayed," she said. "She stayed," he said. Across the table, Joseph asked whether he could be excused to see the horses, and Maggie said that she also wanted to see the horses, and the particular orchestration of a family morning swelled up around them, pulling them both back into the present and its comfortable, necessary motion. But for just that one moment, before the day fully claimed them, they held each other's gaze across the table. 10 years of mornings and seasons and work and grief and laughter and honesty and love accumulated in the space of a single look. And everything that needed to be said was said in it, without a word. Bennett Ellison reached across the table and refilled her coffee cup. She put her hand over his on the handle of the pot and held it there for just a moment. Outside, the November light came up over the east hills, gold and clear and entirely new, the way it was every morning, the way it would be every morning that followed. And on the ranch that had become home, in the kitchen where everything important happened, the day began.